Very much everybody for listening from wherever you are. Please be aware that I cannot see the chat or any of your faces. So I'm speaking as on TV into a camera, but I will have time for questions at the end. So to start with, this is where I'm speaking from. I'm based in Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina, as I've noticed some of you also are. And as you can see in the picture, I hope, you can see that in many ways, the architecture is very European, but there are also lots of blocks of flats. And I don't know if you can see the bottom of my screen, I hope you do, but we are located right at the very southern end of the Latin American continent. And when people think of my city, they generally think of a kind of music, they think of tango, and this is the sort of picture that comes to their minds. And well, that's a bit touristy, let me tell you. And as we're going to be working with culture stereotypes today, I thought I would start by introducing that stereotype and disappoint you, because many of us can't dance the tango like me, but I can sing it. So why am I saying this? Because as you will see, it's relevant to the bridges we will be building during the talk. I'm here in Buenos Aires, Argentina, wherever you are now. Let me tell you where I work. I work across the Atlantic in Britain, in a place called Norwich. In this place, the Norwich Institute for Language Education. Yes, I do local work as well, but that's where I spend the summer, the European summer, my winter, working with teachers from different parts of the world. And why do I mention this? Because for the last 25 years or so, I've been all the time hopping across the Atlantic. And when I do that, I've got to remember to mediate between my culture and the cultures that will be in my classroom and the local culture in Britain. And I wanted to start, being a poet, forgive me, but I will start with a poem, with a little poem I wrote myself because of a culture clash that took place in Norwich. Well, in fact, it was in London. I was having a day off in London many years ago. And the poem starts like this. All of a sudden, you stopped the car and I saw you leap out just to pick up a conker from the road. When I share this with English speakers where I'm from, they don't know what a conker is. As I can't see the chat, I don't know how many of you know what a conker is. But for me, years ago, it was just one of those many fruits and stuff that I don't know what to call. But yeah, if you are British, as some of you are, you will say, of course I know. Well, yes, a conker is the hard, shiny, dark brown nut of a tree that I can't find in my area of Argentina. It's a horse chestnut tree. And here it is. So don't think it's huge. It's small. So, well, my surprise was at the fact that my friend who was driving the car stopped the car in the middle of the road to pick up a conker. So this led me to some reflections, which I believe are relevant in the classroom. Let's go back to the beginning of the poem. But before I do that, have you ever seen the word conker in the plural? Conkers. Yeah, I know. I can sense the smiles of those who come from Britain. A traditional children's game in Great Britain and Ireland, played using the seeds of a horse chestnut tree, the ones we've just seen. The name conker is also applied to the seed and to the tree. The game is played by two players, each with a conker threaded, as you can see in the picture, onto a piece of string. They take turns striking each other's conker until one breaks. Well, I'm not sure children keep on playing this game. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Today, they very often play with electronic games, don't they, with video games? But this is part of the childhood of my generation in Britain, and maybe your parents' generation, I don't know. But it's the sort of experience I didn't have as a child because I didn't grow up in Britain and I played other games. So this led me to writing this poem. I'll start again. All of a sudden, you stopped the car and I saw you leap out just to pick up a conker from the road. A conker, round, rough and spiky, held between your thumb and middle finger, as if you'd found a pearl. It was obvious to you, but I didn't know then, that a conker meant childhood, that there were stories in it, that you could play a game that you could win if you soaked it in vinegar, although that would be cheating. It was indeed a treasure that you had found for me. I accepted your gift as I've been taught to do, smiling politely. I have found it years later in a drawer, split into two. It's been years since I failed to make you see that where I come from, we play other games or bend the rules, that rules don't travel well, that a conker will crack inside a drawer, a sad, dry carcass torn hopelessly into two, so far from where you live, from where it fell. Well, as is normally the case with poetry, you know that the conker here stands for the relationship with the fact that I've never seen that friend again, etc., etc. But the whole point is, no matter how fluent my English was at that time, my lack of shared experience made me see that fruit as just one fruit, and not with all the connotations, with all the memories that that brought to my colleague. And so in some way, we were both lost in translation. So when the millennium was about to start, lots of sociologists, anthropologists, philosophers were being asked about the new century and the new millennium. What was it going to be like? What would the 21st century bring about? Remember, and one of the many people who wrote interesting texts about it was James Clifford. James Clifford is a British anthropologist. And he said, he wrote in a book called Roots, that the key word for the 21st century would be translation. So interesting for us, don't you think, people who work with languages? And he said the following: we will all be part of a kind of culture that we can call a traveling culture. All of us part of traveling cultures. And he says this: everyone will be more or less permanently in transit. So not so much where are you from should be the question we teach in Unit 1, but where are you between? I suppose you understand how deeply personal this can be, and yet how very much in common that is with the rest of humanity. The idea of moving, of transitioning, of being all the time between one thing and the next. And he clarifies this even further, going back to the idea of translation. Traditore, traduttore, you know, an Italian saying that we repeat, every translator is a traitor. In the kind of translation, Clifford writes, that interests me most, you learn a lot about peoples, cultures, and histories different from your own, enough to begin to know what you're missing. I thought, how interesting this attitude is. Instead of saying, oh, I don't understand, or oh, I don't like this at all. This is so different that I don't have it. I'm missing it. And that's what I felt when my friend stopped the car in the middle of the road in London to pick up a conker. I said, this is a game I didn't know about. I was missing it. It wasn't part of my experience. And now, thanks to English, to the fact that he could tell me about why he had stopped the car and pick up the conker and give it to me as a present, that allowed me to be richer culturally, linguistically. Now, when I see a conker, all that memory comes back to me. And it is my contention that this is what we can do with our students. The minute we open a creative text, a literary text, a video, a poem that in some way brings other cultures home into the classroom. So that's the thread for the rest of the talk. Now, Clifford spoke about moving, about transitioning, about traveling, because the word translation in English means not only moving from one language to another, but also what the planets do around the sun, moving about. But then we know what happened in 2020, when lockdown went all over the world, and we were only able to communicate, as we are communicating now, online. And so we were, for the first time, globally subjected to a kind of mediation, which is almost physical. You can see the computer, the device that you have in front of you, and the screen that allows us, ironically, to be in touch without any sense of touch. So how has that changed the way we look at communication? Well, it is changing it as we speak. And the word mediation has now become the new, inverted commas please, word in our profession. Why are we worried about mediation? Why are we trying to redefine mediation? What do we mean by it? And when we try to think of mediation, we generally think of law cases, even a divorce, the fact that there may be a conflict, for example, between two countries, and so we need a mediator to come between us so that there is no war, for example. So yeah, if you look it up, this is what dictionaries will tell you. Mediation is an intervention in a dispute in order to resolve it, and arbitration, if we're thinking politically in particular. It is, in very general senses, an intervention in a process or relationship. And that picture, whose source you've got at the bottom, Hunter Valley News, is taken from an article on legal aspects precisely. And normally you think of mediation as involving three parties, the two parties who don't understand each other, and the third party trying to help, trying to sort out the conflict. Well, that's the traditional meaning, and I think we all understand it. But there's more to it than that, in the sense we're using it in our field. In ELT, the term is used very explicitly in a document which is very important, in Europe in particular, but in the world in general, the Common European Framework for References for Languages, which, as you know, was published back in 2001, and it has affected our profession globally, not only in Europe, the geographical area for which it was meant, because examinations, levels which we grade readers and textbooks in, have been influenced by it. Today we speak of A1, A2, don't we, colleagues? B1, B2, whereas years ago, before the beginning of the millennium, we spoke of beginner, intermediate, advanced, etc. And we know when something is B1 level, something is B2 level, because there are descriptors in the framework to clarify this. And these descriptors are aims that we need to meet in examinations that will say, you speak French at B2 level, for example. And the term mediation does appear in the Common European Framework back in 2001, but as we shall see very much in passing. But there's now a companion volume, as you must know, to the Common European Framework, which was published originally in 2018, and then we now have the 2020 edition, and there the word mediation is central. And mediation is defined in the Common European Framework as instances when a learner, a user of a language, acts as a social agent who creates bridges and helps to construct or convey meaning. When my friend, the one in the poem, remember, was telling me about the games in his childhood that made him think of a conker as something more than a fruit, he was creating a bridge between my experience of children's games and his own, and he was trying to convey meaning so that the next time I saw a conker, I would know this. And you must say, Claudia, that's what we do all the time. That's what we teachers, especially language teachers, do all the time. So yes, no need to be worried about this. Just, I invite you to reflect on this. We are mediators. We are linguistic mediators at home when we teach our children, for example, how to cook something as in the picture. We are cultural mediators when we explain things about our own culture, our own customs. Social mediators between people who do things differently. And of course, as teachers, we are pedagogic mediators. So the central aim of language education back in 1993, Claire Cramch said, was not teaching the present perfect only. It was to address the problem of wanting to express one worldview, one way of seeing the world, through the language normally used to express another society's worldviews. And that is where the mismatch may happen, where the breakdown may take place. When we see the world as we do in different ways, maybe words are not enough. We need an attitude that will be patient, that will be empathic, that will be open to mediating between the two views of the world. So, Chris was saying in his plenary today, don't forget that no matter what our mission is, the conditions in which we work will demand that our students leave each of our classes having learned something more about the language system, more words, more sentences, better pronunciation. I'm not forgetting that. But the Common European Framework is telling us as educators, you do more than that. While you are doing that, because we are doing that, we are teaching vocabulary, we are teaching grammar, etc., etc. While we do that, we are also creating an attitude that will allow our students to become better mediators, better communicators. Let's get a little bit more into detail in this respect. This is how the, let's call it draft for the first edition of the Common European Framework talked about mediation back in 1998. You see, the 90s were a very active decade in terms of cultural studies. Instead of speaking about 4 skills, the framework started speaking about 4 modes of communication. So the 4 skills, reading, writing, speaking, listening, were turned into 2, reception and production, all leading to interaction. And look at that, mediation. The word mediation was introduced as early as that, but then left there without much further explanation. And the framework advocated plurilingual and pluricultural competencies, what today we would refer to as the possibility of translanguaging, of moving among all the languages spoken at home, in the classroom, in the neighborhood, not just one, and seeing ourselves, our students, as social agents, agents of change, agents who will advocate a peaceful world, hopefully. But today, with the 2020 edition of the companion volume, we get descriptors, more than 50 descriptors for mediation. This means there are now these bands that give us objectives that will be assessed in some way or another as part of what we aim at in international examinations. And I've arbitrarily picked up the B1 descriptors. You can go very easily to the companion volume online and read them all. Look how broad they can be. Can collaborate with people from other backgrounds, showing interest and empathy by asking and answering simple questions, formulating and responding to suggestions, asking whether people agree, and proposing alternative approaches. Wow, that's all our students are expected to do. They're really ambitious, isn't it? Can convey the main points made in long texts expressed in uncomplicated language on topics of personal interest, provided they can check the meaning of certain expressions. It's still B1, not B2, C1, okay. And so if we go into more specific objectives, can introduce people from different backgrounds, showing awareness that some questions may be perceived differently, and invite other people to contribute their expertise and experience, as well as their views. Very important skills for the job and for peace in general, for relationships in general. Introduce people from different backgrounds, showing awareness that some questions may be perceived differently. Now, how do we develop those skills in the classroom while we are teaching the language? And how do we assess that these skills we are progressing into? Oh, well, big questions. The framework says that we can mediate between texts, concepts, and communication in general. I'll move rather quickly because you'll get these slides, and besides, you can go to the framework to read this, but just to focus on the activities. Mediating a text involves passing on to another person, it says, the content of a text to which they do not have access, often because of linguistic, cultural, semantic, or technical barriers. And in this sense, the earlier version of the framework was already explicit. We know that intercultural awareness when we bring a reader or a lesson about a country we know nothing about in English, well, that's when we mediate a text that may be too complex for our students. For example, taking notes during a lecture, something that probably you're not doing because you know you're getting the slides. It's a kind of skill that we seem to be losing, or expressing reactions to texts, particularly creative and literary ones, which I hope you've done in relationship to my my poem. You know, you've responded to it by probably saying, or wow, I don't know. So these are ways of mediating a text, and you must be saying, we've always done that. Whenever I bring a text into class, I've done that. Yes, I'm not saying this is new. I'm saying, let's focus on it. Another point then is mediating concepts, facilitating access to knowledge and the concepts for others, particularly if they can't do it by themselves. And as it says there, parents do that, mentors do that, we teachers do that all the time. Last but not least then, mediating communication to facilitate understanding, to shape successful communication between users or learners who may have individual, sociocultural, sociolinguistic, or intellectual differences in standpoint. This is where our multi-level classrooms come into play, where inclusion comes into play. But diplomats are professionals in this respect, negotiators, ourselves in our pedagogy, and dispute resolution. All that involves mediating communication. So, getting down into the classroom, what are some mediation strategies we use? To mediate a text, translate, you say, really? Isn't it English, please, all the time? Well, no. Remember that from 2001, the framework has been talking about plurilingualism. So translation, as we know, can be a technique for teaching, can be a technique for learning, can be a professional activity, of course. Interpreting, summarizing, explaining data or graphics in speech, something which means a transmediation, changing from words to graphics, graphics to text, taking down notes again. All these are activities that involve mediating a text, and which we have in our textbooks and in our classrooms. Mediating concepts, fostering agreement, bridging cultural gaps. It's attitudinal as well as an activity or task that we can develop. And then, to manage communication as a whole, rephrasing, simplifying, clarifying, breaking down complex information. So these are the kind of activities that exams will bring to assess, and they already do, to assess mediation. Rephrase, simplify, clarify, break down complex information. New? No, it isn't. Mediation is also something that goes hand in hand with what has come to be known as 21st century skills or soft skills. Two terms I don't particularly like, but that's a talk. It's a topic for another talk. It's related to personalization, to say, well, how does it apply to you, each and every one of our students? Explaining your own words, summarize, report what you have learned at the end of a session, for example. Collaborative learning. Problem solving in pairs or in groups, when we do group work and ask them to solve a situation, brainstorming to ask probing questions, all that is a form of mediation as well. Effective communication, a 21st century skill, finding ways to communicate in simpler language, in translation, across cultures. So you see, all we've been saying can be reframed as within a 21st century skill sort of aims, if that's what you want. But above all, building empathy and mutual respect, which is what intercultural learning has always aimed at. So how can we help develop tasks that focus on mediation? Well, colleagues, if you already encourage real-life communication in your lessons, you're already doing it. You're already teaching mediation skills. So think around tasks you've already done which we could call mediation tasks, and make sure you check on mediation skills as you develop them. You don't really need to reinvent the tasks you're doing. You can make sure by checking the descriptors in the Common European Framework and then identify activities which are relevant to each of those descriptors in your own context, if that's the case. I mean, in my context, the Common European Framework applies to examinations, but not necessarily in any other respect. We may still want to profit from it by encouraging mediation anyway. Find its potential for mixed level classes, as we were saying before. Encourage collaborative support, as I'm sure you do, between students who have different skills. The one who draws beautifully will draw the storyline, the other one will provide the captions, and they will be collaborating the way companies will want them to do when they start work, if they are not working already. Encourage reflection on mediation, on communicative success, when students self-assess or peer assess. Make sure you focus on mediation, not all the time, but at least say, well, now with this activity, I think we can focus on how successful we have been in summarizing, explaining, simplifying. I'll focus on that this time. And last but not least, hand over your role, as I'm sure you also do. Get students to present their work, get students to bring a summary of their project work, to design tasks, give them the opportunity to bring their own texts into class, and, well, see how they become mediators. But for that, in this talk, I would like to focus on the choice of materials, on the materials that we can pick up, adapt, or actually design ourselves, based mainly on literary texts, videos, poems, creative texts. And you see, of course, global publishers are already getting this on board. This is an example from a new textbook by Oxford University Press, where you have a story, a short creative text, which happens to have the shape of a comic strip. And it's a kind of Robinson family whose boat sinks and they see an island and they are saved, but they have to make a living somehow on a desert island. And it's a great lesson in collaboration, how each and every one of the members of the family will have a different role as the story progresses. At one point, the father says, I'm sorry, we can't take the dogs on the raft to the island. And you can imagine how the children feel about this. So it's a great story for personalization. How would you feel? How would this be different if you landed on a desert island in the Caribbean or in the south of my country where you would freeze, etc., etc., and great opportunities for collaboration. So what has this got to do with mediation? Let's see. These are some of the activities that the textbook presents. One, where it makes you reflect. Francis' feelings when they left the dogs. Imagine the child. Don't worry, the dogs get there. What do you think happens next in the story? Typical textual intervention. Then it links it with life skills. In good teams, every member has a job and they work well together. What jobs do the members of the Swiss family Robinson have? So you see, relating this to 21st century skills, to collaboration. Then look at that. For the first time in my experience, textbooks are adding the word mediation to identify an activity. Mediation. Your friend doesn't speak English. Use, wow, your own language to tell them the story and what you like about it. And you say, oh my God, I'm teaching English, not whatever language the students speak. Well, you see the aim of this activity, which you may want to take into the classroom or not, is one of the mediation skills, translation. You've read the story in English, but your friend doesn't speak English. How do you take the story to your friend? And that happens when we go back home. The family don't speak English, and we want to tell them what we learned in class. Isn't that so? And in real life, it will happen all the time. So that might be a bit of a novelty in texts, encouraging the use of the languages in the classroom. You may debate this. Another kind of translation is across media, as we said before. So this is transmediation and skills integration. We know the textbooks have advocated skills integration for a long time. So you've got a listening that then leads to speaking and writing, and then a project. Well, this is the case here too. But if you have a look at the pictures, you will see that the project is supposed to be made on video. And I'm sure most of your students are very good at making videos in ways I am not. If they are TikTok users, for example, they may be experts. And so here they can show all these mediation skills, these communication skills, but with reference to all they've learned in the lesson, so that they have to go back to the vocabulary they've learned, the grammar they've learned, etc. New? No, it isn't, but you can assess it as a form of mediation. Another unit from another new text, Life Vision. As you can see, lots of devices in the unit, like the one you may be using now, and the unit is about blogging, which your students may or not be interested in. The reason I've brought it in is that, again, one of the activities is called mediation. Look, it says, write a short presentation for a group of people who are new to blogging. So in order to do that, it gives you bullet points of what to consider, so it's guided writing, but it asks you to go back to the listening and the reading they've done before, so integrating skills, and then they've got to do the presentation in class. So you know what I did? I said, do I want to give it a try? I'll ask artificial intelligence to do that for me. What if I ask ChatGPT or any other AI software to do that for me? And so I copied every single piece of the instructions on the textbook into ChatGPT and asked it to do it for me. And I'm not going to read this with you. No, it's very boring. But look at the beginning of each paragraph. Hello, everyone. First, let's define what a blog is. To start your own blog, once you've chosen your platform, very well organized text, I must say. So I didn't ask it to reframe. I went on. Now it's time to start creating content as you begin blogging. Secondly, finally, in conclusion, very well organized. So yeah, I could have cheated. I could have said, here you are. This is the essay I've written on blogging. But as the instructions made reference to a listening, I had to make sure that I compared this essay to the listening. And then I said, are all the instructions the same, or am I omitting something? So this was a great opportunity with my students to evaluate what ChatGPT did for us and apply HOT's higher order thinking skills with questions like, does the advice given by ChatGPT cover all the points required in the task? Surely not, because it doesn't know. And you must be thinking, Claudia, there are programs that allow you to feed the whole listening and the whole reading into it. Yes, I know, but we can still compare, contrast, and evaluate. How does the information compare with the tips in exercise 2 and the listening? Is the advice on ChatGPT better, worse? Why? So you need to evaluate and think critically to be able to do that. And what's more, you can extend this by giving ChatGPT or any other program different instructions and compare the results. Why are the results different? Change the public being addressed. I asked ChatGPT to do the same thing, thinking that I was an elderly person who hates technology and is really reluctant to read a blog on screen. Did it do anything different? No, it just told me in the last paragraph, but don't worry if you don't like this. Okay, but it didn't solve the problem. So I just found very excited students applying this and seeing that I was using ChatGPT rather elementary, in an elementary way. So to give it a further turn of the screw, if we think of our students using artificial intelligence and screens all the time, I said, no, explain to a child in the year 2155 what this is. And I hope children at that time will know that this is a book. But probably it does need some explanation. And why did I ask that? And why did I ask 2155 and not any other year? And some of you must know already. This is because that's the year in which this story, which was science fiction when Isaac Asimov wrote it, develops. He wrote it in the 50s. And it's a story about two children in 2155 who find a book and they don't know what it is. And they start getting very interested in the fact that the words are printed and they don't move around the screen. And then they start talking about teachers because they have a teacher who speaks on screen. And they say, my dad cannot know as much as the teacher knows, the teacher on screen. And what is the book about? The book is about schools. Schools? What are schools? Because their only schooling is at home through a screen. Lots of teachers used this story during the pandemic, during lockdown, to get their students to talk about what was happening to them in the light of the story. This is a creative text we can stop and reflect on mediation with. So one of the texts I recommend. Another one is a poem by Craig Raine, written in 1979, which is called A Martian Sends a Postcard Home. A great exercise in point of view. If a Martian saw us doing what we are doing wherever we are today, would he or she make sense? And the first thing Craig Raine does in the poem is explain what a Martian thinks a book is. And he doesn't call it books, he calls them Caxtons, because as you must know, Caxton was the person who introduced Gutenberg's printing press into Britain. So for them, a book is a Caxton, something that Caxton brought into England. So Caxtons, the Martian thinks, are mechanical birds with many wings. Have you seen the wings in the previous picture? And some are treasured for their markings, for the words. They cause the eyes to melt or the body to shriek without pain. I've never seen one fly, but sometimes they perch on the hand. Isn't it great? Well, you can pick up the poem from any webpage and read the rest. What he says about dreams, what he says about all sorts of different things we do and we take for granted. So you've got a story and a poem already. And I tried out this activity, getting students to explain to me how this thing works. Maybe some of you very young people there don't know. Others would say, oh, I sit in the class. This, which is more recent, the 80s, and they had a lot of fun trying to explain this. And this was the most difficult one, getting them to use the rotary, you know, the dial, and understand that they had to listen for the tone. That was really hard. Why did I do it? Because I think that mediating between age groups is another very important skill. When our students get nervous with parents or grandparents because they can't use technology very well, I sometimes say, well, let's go back in time and see what our world was like. And it gets interesting, you know. But now I'm going to show you the odd one out. I also got them to explain what this is. And this is something that those who are Uruguayans, Argentinians, Paraguayans, Brazilians in the audience must know, but maybe others don't. And that is called mate. And it's a drink that we drink and pass on from hand to hand. So how to prepare a good mate is one of the great skills, survival skills, I would say, in our culture. But then explaining that to a foreigner in English may be a bit challenging, because we sort of take it for granted. So we've got to play the role of Martians sending a postcard home and finding out the vocabulary and the words to explain the procedure to a foreigner. So what I do is go to the web, and there are thousands of YouTube videos made by visitors on how to make a good mate. And you know what? Some of them are wonderful, some of them are horrible. And that's where our students feel terribly empowered, because they've got to make their own videos correcting what's wrong in the video. They are mediating between cultures and also finding the linguistic mediation necessary to explain this. Because what's the word for mate in English? There isn't one. Of course there isn't. And I'm sure you're thinking of similar drinks or food in your culture, and maybe there's something else. It's not only the drink, it's the way you pass it around, the way it stands in our medium for friendship and hospitality. Like the conker in my poem at the beginning of the talk, passing on a mate to someone when he or she comes home is a very important sign of hospitality. And I need to transfer that together with the explanation of how you make the drink. So, great. But we need the words. We need the words to mediate in a foreign language. I need the words to explain what you call the cup where you make a mate. It's a gourd of sorts. To explain that the straw I put into the mate is not just the straw, that it's got a filter at the end, and the filter so that you don't burn your fingers, etc., etc., your lips, sorry, etc. So we need language for mediation. Things like, let me explain. What do you mean by, I'll give you an example, or I'll show you what I have in mind. I'll make it more precise. I'll give you further details. We will need to teach this early on if we are to meet the aims of the Common European Framework for mediation, even at A2 level. And not only that, we will need to bring into the class the vocabulary we need to talk about ourselves, to talk about our own culture. In my case, I bring novels like these that will mean nothing to someone abroad, but if you're local, you will say, ah, there are these books. So go and find texts written in English about your local region or country, and see if you can pick up pieces from them where the necessary vocabulary is either provided or glossed. Because very often you will find in these books the word mate, and immediately after that, the drink that we offer someone when they come into our homes and we pass it around, they explain, and that gives our students the language they need to talk about themselves. And just to give you an example, in my class, we were reading novels from Africa. Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun. And in both novels, they speak a number of times about cola nuts. And my students just read on. They said, okay, they are nuts. But they missed the importance of the ritual that cola nuts have in certain parts of Nigeria in particular, and in the Igbo ethnic group, rather than in other groups. So suddenly, finding out about the cola nut took us doing a lot of research into the culture of the novels we were reading. And you know what? My students said, oh, this is just like our mate. It's a ritual. It's not only food. And how rude it would be, they told me, if somebody gave you a cola nut and you rejected it. Just as rude as rejecting a mate. So suddenly, thanks to English, we were mediating between two cultures that probably have not met before, and they've met through literature. So if nothing else, that's what I'd like you to remember from this talk. I'm very aware of the time. I've picked up papers on the cola nut ceremony from the web. It's so interesting. I learned so much just by that mention. The text mediated the cola nut ceremony for me. And last but not least, there are videos, of course, so important in our culture now, and there's video poetry. There are poems which are not just illustrated by videos, that are integral parts of videos. The images and the words go together. And I would like to share, if the share screen feature allows me, a video by this poet. If you go to his webpage very easily, Google that, Raymond Antrobus. Raymond Antrobus is a deaf poet, and he has written a poem called Two Guns in the Sky for Daniel Harris. Daniel Harris, this is a true story, and I learned that through the newspaper, was killed by the police by mistake. The motorway police stopped him, and he started signing, because he was deaf, using sign language, and they thought he was going to take out a gun, and they shot him dead. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second and change the feature, if that's all right, Monica. And now I'll share again. Let's see if I can go to the video gallery. And this is taken from the video gallery in Raymond's webpage. Oh, I need to go back, sorry. No.
When Daniel Harris stepped out of his car, the police officer was waiting, gun raised. I used the past tense so this is irrelevant in Daniel's language, which is sign. Sign has no future or past tense. It is a present language. You are never more present than when a gun is pointed at you. What language says this if not sign? But the police officer saw hands waving in the air, fired, and Daniel dropped his hands, his chest bleeding out onto the concrete meters from his home. And I'm in New York coffee house reading this news on my phone when a black policewoman walks in, 2 guns on her hips. My friend next to me reading the comment section, Black Lives Matter. Now what could we sign or say out loud? And the last words I learned in American Sign Language was alive. Alive. Both thumbs pointing at your lower abdominal, index fingers pointing up, like 2 guns in the sky.
Okay, I hope you've been able to listen to that clearly. I've worked with the poem, with the video, of course, and with the piece of news in the newspaper, which you can find easily on the web. And above all, to develop awareness of the importance of sign language and how little we know, teachers in particular, in my case at least, about how to mediate in these cases. So I hope this has started reflection on this. And to finish, to say goodbye, a little poem by Roger McGough that reflects on this. And it's not because you and I don't speak English, it's because there's more to mediation than just language. I explain quietly, you hear me shouting. You try a new tack, I feel old wounds reopen. You see both sides, I see your blinkers. I am placatory, you sense a new selfishness. I am a dove, you recognize the hawk. You offer an olive branch, I feel the thorns. You bleed, I see crocodile tears. I withdraw, you reel from the impact. Well, hope we can mediate so that you and I get to know each other better and understand each other better. Thank you very much indeed. I'm ready for questions if there's time. This is where you can find me. You can write to me on the webpage. You can contact me on Instagram as Clau Ferradas, and I'm ready for questions. Thanks a lot for listening.